I hear that my people are in trouble again. My people are always in trouble because the world hates us. The world hates us because Satan, the enemy of the great God Jehovah, hates us. He hates anything that God favors. And God has always favored the Jewish people. I am Jewish. But I would tell you this. You need to know the great God Jehovah will never suffer his nation to be annihilated. He will never allow his children to be destroyed. And he will use whatever means he needs to or wants to save his children. And he will use whoever is willing to be used. Did you hear me? He will use whoever is willing to be used. Keep that in mind. I am Hadassah. That is my Hebrew name. You know me better by my Persian name. I am Queen Esther. And I am here tonight to give you my testimony of how the great God Jehovah used a little orphan girl to save his people. My father was Amiel. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. My father and mother were killed when I was very young. I was like 4 to 5 years old. At that time and in that culture, we did not have the things that you have today. We did not have orphanages or foster homes. A young orphan was at the mercy of family. Thankfully, my father Amiel had a brother who had a son who was already grown, a grown man, and he took me in as his very own child. Mordecai was his name, and I loved Mordecai. He was as good a father to me as anyone could ever be. He taught me our Hebrew language. He taught me the traditions of our people. He taught me about temple worship, but most importantly, he taught me about the great God Jehovah and how he loves his children. Now, he had to teach me these things because we were not living in our homeland. We did not live in the land of Israel. We lived in a land of Persia, the kingdom of Persia. Now, the kingdom of Persia was very large and very strange to me. They had a strange language. They had bizarre customs. They were just different from the way Mordecai had raised me. And the culture then was very similar to the culture you live in today because it was driven by greed, power, and pleasure. Can you identify with that? I'm sure you see it every day, not only in the headlines, but in the daily lives of the people around you. So the kingdom of Persia was different for me, but I learned to assimilate myself into that culture mainly by keeping my peace. And Mordecai was very strict on do not tell anyone that you are Jewish. We are in a foreign country, and you never know when that will not be popular anymore, and people would turn on you because of your ethnicity, so don't tell. So I didn't make waves. I went about my business. I lived my life quietly. King Ahasuerus was the king of this time in Persia. Now, he reigned over 127 provinces that stretched from India to Ethiopia. That is a lot of land. In your country, that's the equivalent of Washington, D.C., all the way to Los Angeles, California. That is a large amount of country and a large amount of people. King Ahasuerus ruled these people. And he had a queen, and her name was Vashti. Vashti was beautiful. She was just the most gorgeous creature. One time, I was in the marketplace with Mordecai, and her caravan came through. And I tried to get a peek of her because as a young 13-year-old girl, that was just very exciting. So I did get a glimpse of her. And she was just as glorious as I had been told. And her clothes were just amazingly beautiful. And her jewelry, oh, it just made a young 13-year-old girl dream for hours of the glory and just the prestige it would be to be the queen. I mean, you would have to be the queen, and how wonderful it would be to be the queen. My friends and I all dreamed of that, being the queen. But Vashti was a good queen. She was a very kind woman. Now, during this same period, King Ahasuerus wanted to go to war with Greece. Now, in this culture, when you wanted to go to war, you had to prove to your kingdom, the inhabitants of your kingdom, that you could not only afford this, but you had the resources to win a war. It was very costly to go to battle. So King Ahasuerus called all the princes and the governors and the officials of each province to the palace at Shushan to display his wealth to them. Now, Shushan was the city I lived in, and that was where the palace was. That's near your present-day city of Susa, Iran. So all of these men came, and for 6 months, King Ahasuerus put his wealth on display to these men. He showed them his vast lands, his cattle, his gold, his jewels, the opulence of his palace. And they were well pleased, and they thought he could possibly win a war with Greece. So at the end of the 6 months period, he had a feast, a 1-week feast for all of these men. During the time of the feast, after they had well drunk, he decided there was one more possession that he had that he wanted to show off to these men, his queen. Unfortunately, at that time, women were considered more a possession than a life partner, as today. So he sent a servant to Queen Vashti, have her come in her royal array in all her beauty to be displayed. But Queen Vashti refused. And you did not refuse the king. If he called for you, you went. If he gave you something to do, you did it. Because to refuse the king was to take your life into your own hands. I often wondered why she refused. It could have been that during that time there was a law that prohibited women from presenting themselves and putting themselves on display in front of men. Or she could have just not wanted to be seen by all of these drunken men. But for whatever reason, she refused to come. The king was furious. He said, "What must be done to Queen Vashti? She has disobeyed me." So his counselors and his advisors put their collective brain together, and they told him, "O king, if word of Vashti's disobedience gets out into the kingdom, then all of the women will begin to disobey their husbands, and we cannot have such rebellion." And he agreed. So he banished Queen Vashti from the kingdom. And when you have a kingdom that large, it takes a long time to get out of it. And the fact that she could never come back in was heart-wrenching. However, the rumor did go about that he didn't banish her, but that he executed her. I hope he didn't. Banishment doesn't sound so bad then. I hope he didn't. She was such a sweet, sweet queen. I pray that she's still alive. After a year or two, King Ahasuerus missed having a queen. So the same advisors and counselors got together again and decided that they had a plan he might agree to, and they presented it to him. "O king, send throughout all of the provinces and gather all the beautiful young virgins of marriageable age, bring them to the palace of Shushan, let them be purified for up to a year, and then one at a time, one night at a time, you have the virgins come to your place, and then you pick the one that pleases you the most." Well, as most Persian men would have done, he thought that was a very good idea. So they sent word to all the provinces to gather together all the beautiful young virgins of marriageable age. And I was taken. I was very beautiful when I was younger. I was taken to the palace. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. It wasn't my nature. I was very obedient to Mordecai. I always did what he told me. But I knew when they took me, this meant the end to the dreams I had of having a husband who loved me and a family and working to build a life together. I knew that that would never happen now because I knew enough about what happened in the palace to know where I was headed. But at the same time, I had the feeling that Jehovah God was working. You don't always know when things happen in your life if he's working in them or not, but I had the feeling that he was working. So I was taken to the palace, and I remembered what Mordecai told me to never tell my nationality, and I did not tell my nationality. I was put into the court of the virgins under the charge of Hegai. Hegai was the eunuch in charge of all of the young virgins as they came in, and he was a very kind man, and I was obedient to him just as I had been to Mordecai. And he took a liking to me. He favored me. A lot of the other girls weren't cooperative. So Hegai favored me, and he gave me the best rooms in the court of the virgins. And he gave me 7 handmaidens to wait upon me. Now at this time, I was just a 15-year-old girl. 15. He saw that I got my beauty treatments sooner than everybody else and everything that I asked for. The first 6 months, we were purified with myrrh. Now, I knew about myrrh because Mordecai had taught me that myrrh was used in our temple worship. So I was excited about that. And they lotioned us and oiled us with myrrh, like lotion, and they put it in our hair, and we bathed in it. And then the second 6 months, we were purified with sweet odors like cinnamon and cassia, and we could stand over the incense burners, and it would just infuse us. It was very intoxicating odors. And I know this may sound strange to your culture, but it would be the equivalent of living for an entire year in a spa. So it wasn't that bad. But soon, the time came that it was my night to go into the king. I can't tell you how frightened I was. I was 16. And this king was over 40. When it was the time for the virgin to go in, she got to choose anything she wanted from the court of the virgins. She could choose the attire she wanted. She could choose the jewelry. Anything she wanted to take with her, she could. After her night, she was sent to the house of the concubines. And that's where I well expected to go. And I knew that that's when I would never see the king again unless he called for me by name. In the house of the concubines, I would live with all the other ladies, and I would never be able to marry or have children. So when it came my time, I didn't know what to do, so I went to Hegai, and I said, Hegai, what should I take? And he told me what to wear. He told me what jewelry to take, and I obeyed. So I went into the king, and there was an instant attraction to him for me. And it wasn't just my beauty. He was attracted to the way I presented myself and the way I carried myself. And before the night was over, he had placed the queen's crown upon my head and declared me to be queen. I can't tell you how exciting the next day was. It was so exciting because he proclaimed a feast throughout the entire kingdom. All 127 provinces were to have a feast in my honor, and he called it the Feast of Esther. I had never had anything like that. I mean, Mordecai made a good living. He worked in the palace, but this was beyond my wildest dreams. So I settled into the role of queen, and it wasn't long after that Mordecai came to me, and he had overheard 2 doorkeepers in the palace, Bigthan and Teresh. He had overheard them plotting to kill the king, an assassination plot. Well, he brought the information to me so that I could present it to the king. So the next time the king summoned me, I gave him the information, and I gave Mordecai all the credit. And he had it investigated and found out it was true. They were planning to assassinate King Ahasuerus. So he had them executed. So Mordecai actually saved his life. Now, King Ahasuerus, I forgot to tell you that you may know him by his Greek name, which was King Xerxes. It is the same person, just so that you'll know. At the time that happened with Bigthan and Teresh, or right after that, there was a man in the kingdom that had been in power for quite a while. Authority, not really power. He had been in authority as one of my husband's administrators, but he had worked his way up. And my husband was so impressed with him that he named him Prime Minister, which is second in command in the kingdom. It would be similar to your office of Vice President. But this man was an evil man. He was wicked. He was vile. He had a murderous, hateful spirit, and he was full of the devil. This man was pure wickedness. We called him Haman. You deal with the same wicked, murderous spirit in your society today, except it's one letter different. You call it Hamas. It's the same spirit that operates in every terrorist organization in the world today, was the same spirit that operated in Haman. So he all of a sudden got elevated to second in command. Of course, I couldn't question anything that my husband did. I was only allowed to see him when he called for me. My husband made a decree that people would bow to Haman the same as they bowed to him out in public and in the king's court. Now, the Persian people, this is where they're very different from Jewish people. The Persian people worshiped their leaders as gods. Now, Jewish people only worship Jehovah God. We would bow in respect and honor of a leader, but never in worship. No. But the Persian people did regularly. That was their culture. That was their belief. So King Ahasuerus made it to where everyone had to bow in worship to Haman as well as himself. The first time Haman went through the streets, some people noticed that Mordecai did not bow. So they questioned him, "Why did you not bow in front of the great Haman?" And Mordecai broke his silence, and he told them, "Because I am a Hebrew, and Hebrew people only bow to the one God, the great God, Jehovah." Well, these people decided that they would see if his excuse for not bowing to Haman would hold up. So they went to Haman, and they, I believe you would say, snitched on him. So Haman was beside himself with anger. How would anybody dare not bow to the great Haman? That's how he thought. That was his arrogance and his pride. Everyone should bow to him. So he devised a plan, not only to kill Mordecai, but to kill all the Jewish people who wouldn't bow to him either. And he brought it before the king. It's, "Oh, king," he said, "do you realize that there's a nation of people dwelling amongst us who do not believe like we do? They do not bow to us. They do not worship us. They worship a strange God to us named Jehovah. They do not share our beliefs and our customs. Let us set a date in the future. We will cast lots to find the lucky day," which was another Persian tradition. "We will cast lots to find the lucky day, and we will proclaim a law that says on that day, any Persian can kill any Jewish person and take all of their worldly belongings for himself. That way we'll be rid of them, and your people will be increased in wealth." And the king said, "Well, as you will, do as you will." Genocide was not uncommon in that day, and they thought nothing of it. So Haman made the law out, stamped it with the signet ring of the king, and sent it through Shushan and into the 127 provinces. I did not know about this. A couple of days later, my handmaidens came to me and said, Mordecai is sitting outside the king's gate in ashes, wearing sackcloth, and he's weeping and mourning. And I thought, why is he doing this? They'll know he's Jewish. So I got a suit of clothes together, and I said, take these to Mordecai, have him put them on. Well, I sent Hatach. I didn't send my maidens. You didn't do that. I sent Hatach, a male servant of mine. Hatach came back, and he said, Mordecai refuses. And I couldn't understand this. I said, go back. Find out, why is he weeping and mourning? What has happened? So Hatach went back. He came back to me with a copy of the law, the proclamation. I read it and my heart dropped. My people. And then he gave me a charge from Mordecai. He said, Mordecai said to tell you, he charged you, which is more than just telling. He charged, which is like a command. He said he charged you to go before the king and beg for the lives of your people. I was overcome. I couldn't believe Mordecai would ask me to do this. And I had never disobeyed Mordecai. But what he was asking me to do could cost me my life. To go before the king without being summoned was a death sentence. Only a very few people did he accept, and the way you knew you were accepted is if he raised the golden scepter to you. And that very rarely happened. I hadn't seen the king in 30 days. And he was asking me to put my life on the line. And so I sent word back with Hatach. I said, tell him this, that if I go before the king without being summoned, I could die. And I haven't seen him in 30 days. So Hatach went. He came back. And what he said to me, it cut so deep. But I knew it was true. Mordecai said, don't you think for a minute that you will escape this. If you refuse to fight for your people, to beg for their lives, God will deliver them some other way, but you and your household will perish. Who knows if you were brought into the kingdom for such a time as this? I can't tell you what I felt like. It's hard to even describe it. Just the sheer agony of knowing that was true, but also knowing I could die on the spot. Before I even got a word out, my head could be taken off. So I sent word back, and I told Mordecai to gather the Jews in Shushan and fast for me for 3 days and nights. And my maidens and I would also fast. And you know, with fasting comes prayer. There's no way to get around that. That's what I was asking them to do. I said, on the 3rd day, I will go before the king. For 3 days, I struggled. I struggled with Jehovah because I knew he was working. I knew it was his will, but I could not get past my own will. The will to live, the worry, the fear that I would die the instant I walked into the court of the king. My very own husband, but in that culture, it didn't matter. So I struggled. And by the 3rd day, I had come to peace with Jehovah. And I agreed that this was his plan for me. And I submitted myself to that. And I said, I will go before the king. And if I perish, I perish. So at the end of the fast, I put on all of my beautiful robes and gowns, and I put my crown on. And I went, and I walked straight in to the court of the king, and I stood at the doorway. And there were maybe 50 to 75 men in the room, counselors, advisors, administrators, servants, and then Haman and my husband. And I just stood there, and every eye was on me, and I was shaking. And I just waited, and I looked at my husband, and he sat and looked at me for a minute or two, and then he kind of slowly smiled, and he raised the golden scepter to me, and I knew I would not die that day, but I still might. So I walked up and I touched the end of the scepter as we were required to do, and he said, Queen Esther, what is your request? Make it known, and I will grant it up to half my kingdom. And looking around at all of these men looking at me, and this was personal. I was fixing to beg for my life and the life of my people. And I couldn't do it in front of all these strangers. And so I thought quickly, I said, O King, if I have found favor in your sight, please come to my palace today with Prime Minister Haman for a feast of wine. And the king agreed. So my palace was part of the palace compound, but it was my area. So we went back and we had our feast, and the king said, Esther, what is your request? Make it known, and I will grant it up to half my kingdom. And somehow I knew it was not time yet. It must have been Jehovah telling me this. It was not time yet, and I didn't know why. But I said, Oh, my Lord the King, if it pleases you and I have found favor in your sight, you and Prime Minister Haman come back tomorrow for another feast of wine, and I will most certainly make my request known. And he agreed. So he left, and Haman left. And that afternoon, Haman went back out into the streets of the city, past Mordecai, who did not bow. And it infuriated him. He couldn't stand it. And he couldn't stand to wait until the day proclaimed in the next couple of months to kill all the Jews. He went home and had a gallows built that day at his house. Is that not odd? And his plan was the next morning when he went into the court of the king for his work day, his duties as prime minister, that he would ask King Ahasuerus for the life of Mordecai that very day. That's what he decided. But oh, Jehovah was working. Jehovah is always working. Please understand that in your own lives. If you're waiting for an answer, if you don't know what to do, don't think that he is not working. He is always working. Even when you don't see it, even when you don't know it, and it looks like all is hopeless, he is always working for the good of his people. Please remember that. And the way he was working this time is he was troubling the sleep of the king. The king could not sleep that night, and he paced back and forth in his chambers. And he called for the readers to come in, and the readers brought in the chronicles of his kingdom, of his reign, all the things that had been accomplished. And they would read to him from these books of everything that had happened since he had been king. And they got to the part where Mordecai had told him of the Bigthan and Teresh's plot to assassinate him. And the reader read it, and the king said, What was done for Mordecai for this act of loyalty? And the reader searched, and he said, Nothing was done for him, my king. So the king started thinking. And the next morning, when Haman went plowing into the court of the kings with his plan and his plot to kill Mordecai that day, the king spoke first. And he said, Haman, what should be done for the man the king wants to honor? Well, in Haman's arrogance and pride, he thought, well, that must be me. Who else could he want to honor but me? So he got a little puffed up and he said, O king, for the man you would like to honor, dress him in a royal suit that you have worn yourself. Sit him on a royal steed that you have ridden, and have a prince of the city, or the prince of the palace, walk him about the city upon the steed and proclaim, this is what happens to the man the king wants to honor. He thought that would set him up pretty good. And the king said, good idea, Mordecai. I'm sorry, good idea, Haman. Today, I want you to accomplish everything you just said for Mordecai. Haman was crestfallen. The humiliation almost drowned him. Can you imagine? He was going to ask for Mordecai's life, and the king said, honor him. But Haman did it because you do not disobey the king and live. So he got Mordecai, dressed him in the king's clothing, set him upon the king's steed, and he himself led him about the city of Shushan, proclaiming, this is what happens to the man the king wants to honor. When it was over, he went home, terribly, terribly downtrodden. He was complaining to his family about what had happened, and they said, oh, you cannot lift your hand against the man the king honors. And Haman thought his day was pretty bad. And then the servant came to take him to the feast of wine, the second feast of wine. What Haman didn't know was his day was fixing to get worse. We had our feast, and the king said, Queen Esther, it is time. Make known your request. I will grant it up to half my kingdom. And I knelt down at the king's feet, and I said, O king, spare my life and the life of my people. We do not want to die like this. And he said, Queen Esther, what are you talking about? And I said, this wicked man has devised a plan to kill all Jewish people, and he has signed my death sentence. I am a Hebrew. Please spare me and my people. And he stood up, and he was shaking. And he looked at Haman with murder in his eyes. And he stormed out of the palace. And I watched him. I could see him in the garden, walking, pacing back and forth. And I was just sitting quietly, and I was shaking. I'll just be honest, I was very scared. I mean, my life was in the balance. And I glanced over at Haman, and he had turned white as a sheet. And he was shaking also. His life was in the balance too. And about the time the king, remember, my husband, walked back in the room, right before he entered the room, Haman jumped up, ran over, and threw himself across my lap, begging for his life. I just sat still. I didn't know what to do. This grown man was begging an 18-year-old girl to save him. And that's the time my husband walked in the room, the king. And he saw this man across my lap. I thought he was mad before. But he said, what? Will you molest the queen in front of me and in the palace? And when he said that, the servants ran over, threw a black cloth over Haman's head, got him up off of me, looked at the king and said, O king, he built a gallows at his house. He was going to hang Mordecai on it today with your permission. The king looked at him and said, very well, hang him on his own gallows. And they did. And the king gave to me all of Haman's earthly possessions. And I in turn gave them to Mordecai. The king was so taken with Mordecai that he elevated him in authority to, you guessed it, prime minister instead of Haman. The Jews in the kingdom were extremely happy that they had a representative in such a high place as prime minister, but we still had a problem. The law was still on the book that on a certain day, Persians could kill Jews and take all their possessions. And the law could not be reversed. It was our Persian culture that no law could be reversed, even by the king. So Mordecai and the king got together and decided they would make a second law that would counteract the first law. The second law said that on the same day, any Jew could kill any Persian and take all of their worldly possessions. Well, this struck fear in Jew and Persian. And very few people died that day. Now, the Jews throughout the region were so relieved, so ecstatic that Jehovah had delivered them, that they proclaimed a feast. Now, when I told you Haman cast lots to find the perfect day to kill them on, the word for cast lots is pure. So when the Jews decided to make their feast proclaiming and celebrating their deliverance, they called it the Feast of Purim. And it is still celebrated this day around the world once a year. This year, the Feast of Purim was on February the 26th. And they have kept it all these years. I did not know that I would be called upon by Jehovah God to lay my life on the line, to confront evil. I did not know that he would ask me to do something like this, to submit myself, to lay my will down. I did not know that. But he expects no less of you than he did of me. Will you submit your will to the great God Jehovah? He has revealed himself to you in even a greater way than I had. He has revealed himself to you through the love, the death, burial, and resurrection of his Son. It is the same God that you worship, that I worshiped. You just have a different covenant and a better, clearer picture than I had. Have you given your will to him? Would you do what he asked? Would you be like Isaiah and say, "Here I am, Lord, send me. And if I perish, I perish"? Would you proclaim his name to all your family, acquaintances, town, area? Would you proclaim his name and say, "If I perish, I perish"? Would you stand for righteousness and confront evil and say, "If I would you confront the forces of darkness in your house, to the church house, to the schoolhouse, even to the White House, and say, "If I Each of you is here tonight for a reason. There are no coincidences. Each of you were born for a reason. What are you doing with your life? Does he have control? Because I guarantee you, each one of you here was born at this juncture in history for such a time as this.